In the ashes of World War II, many nations in Eastern Europe were brought under the occupation of the Soviet Union. Deep in the dense forests of Lithuania, a guerrilla movement was formed in the face of this occupation. Brave resistance fighters called the Forest Brothers managed to sustain armed resistance against the powerful Soviet military and secret police until 1956. But how could the Forest Brothers of Lithuania survive for so long against a vastly superior force? At the heart of this resistance was a desire for independence. It gave each Forest Brother the strength to continue fighting against insurmountable odds. But they were not alone. The foundation of the partisan survival was the local support they received from everyday Lithuanians. The local support was vital, offering both necessary supplies, shelter, and crucial information. Another significant advantage the Forest Brothers had was their environment. The Lithuanian forests provided a small and decentralized fighting force the necessary cover to evade, sabotage, and ambush Soviet forces. It was also important for the small resistance of groups to adopt guerrilla-style hit-and-run tactics, to give their significantly smaller numbers a tactical advantage over the superior Soviet forces. Despite their cause being limited by a lack of foreign support, a small part of their longevity was a product of the local incorporation of foreign troops into their ranks. This is the story of Lithuania's fight for independence, their fight for freedom or death. For any guerrilla movement to begin and sustain resistance against a superior force, it is absolutely necessary that the movement is driven by a mass cause to rally behind. When partisans are being hunted by a far superior enemy and they are living in harsh conditions, a cause gives them purpose to continue fighting. In China, Mao's guerrilla fighters were unified through communism, and guerrilla fighters in Tibet, Napoleonic Spain, and Soviet Afghanistan were sustained by religion. In the case of Lithuania, the resistance to Soviet occupation was driven by a desire for national independence. Their idea of national independence is not just about seeking a Lithuanian state for Lithuanians, but also about securing safety for those who would face oppression under a Soviet regime. Any occupying force adopting oppressive and radical policies will undoubtedly face resistance from the local population. The Lithuanians' experience of World War II with brutal occupations of their homeland by both the Soviet Union and by Nazi Germany proved to them that they had no choice but to resist for their own safety. Hence why the Forest Brothers movement began during the second Soviet occupation. Without a cause and significant threat to resist, resistance fighters would be less likely to risk their lives. The partisan oath reveals the importance of national independence, as well as religion, in encouraging Lithuanians to join the Forest Brothers and put their lives at risk.
I swear, in the name of Lord God, that with loyalty and conscientiousness, I undertake the duties of a freedom fighter for Lithuania, and that I will fight for Lithuania's freedom and for the reinstatement of Lithuania's independence. I will not regret losing my wealth, my health, or even my life.
While the partisan oath is merely symbolic and does not necessarily mean that all partisans are motivated to fight because of an ideal for national independence, the Lithuanians actively tied their movement into national pride in multiple ways. They would wear old Lithuanian military uniforms with ranks and medals, to both tap into Lithuanian tradition and evoke a feeling of discipline, to portray themselves as more than simple bandits or criminals. The Lithuanians would also go across the border into Poland, where they had more freedom to embrace their national spirit. They would speak, pray, and sing entirely in Lithuanian, doing a lot to preserve the strong national culture that the Soviet Union was trying to eradicate. Catholicism was instrumental in retaining national identity for these partisans. Not only did these partisans believe it was their religious duty to fight for national independence, but they also were supported directly by the Lithuanian Catholic Church. The church preserved Lithuanian identity through the publication of propaganda-free journals. These journals were intended to document what the Soviet Union was doing to Lithuania, to reveal the true nature of the occupation, and enshrine in Lithuanian memory their resistance to such oppression. This provided a morale boost to those seeking an independent Lithuania, as the brutal occupation was put on full display. The church would also refuse to condemn the partisans despite pressure from the Soviet forces, A condemnation would delegitimize the movement's spiritual foundation and would likely cause some Lithuanians to turn away from partisan activity in the name of religion. The refusal to condemn the partisan activity was a courageous act of defiance and was essential to maintain the religious convictions the Lithuanian partisans held. Evidently, the idea of independent Lithuania, intertwined with Catholic identity, was highly motivating for these partisans. It provided them with a cause to fight for, and without it, the movement might not have survived for as long as they did. The Lithuanian partisans had the support of the locals, which provided them immense help in surviving against the Soviet occupation. Guerrilla movements cannot successfully wage a war of resistance without gaining the local support. Local support provides a guerrilla force with greater access to supplies and a significant boost in security and information. Guerrilla armies do not hold set land or infrastructure, and instead allow the occupying force to control the territory. Accordingly, partisans to survive on their own in the forest must rely on the public to source food, medicine, and other necessary supplies. Without this supply, partisans will grow hungry, become ill, and generally be weakened as a fighting force. Importantly, local support can continue to function even when the partisans are in hostile territory. This support was not just important to the Lithuanian forest brothers to keep them well fed and healthy, but also provided them with greater mobility. Unlike traditional militaries who were forced to rely on and protect supply lines to maintain combat effectiveness, the Lithuanian forest brothers do not operate with a set supply infrastructure. Instead, they live off the locals and their land, giving the partisans a significant mobility advantage over a more resource-dependent Soviet army. Security is also critical to the survival of the partisans, who generally found safety amongst the local population. The locals provided shelter, information, and assistance with communication, which all helped to keep partisans safer from Soviet forces. Partisans often found themselves taking refuge in farms during the day. They would also hand the locals partisan newspapers and other written communications for the locals to distribute to other partisans. This was a more careful way to communicate between partisan groups, as it eliminated the need for partisans to travel directly to each other. Instead, they could gather any communications from the locals. The locals also gathered their own information and communicated about the movements of the Soviet forces or the presence of collaborators to the partisans, reducing the partisans' risks of ambushes and infiltrations.
For dinner, we go to the house of another farmer. We walk everywhere in the daytime. People are so nice here. If the rations are seen anywhere, people come in throngs to tell us.
However, not all locals supported the partisans. Some collaborated with the Soviet government. Many of the partisans captured, tortured, or killed was a result of the locals providing information to the Soviet forces. Consequently, the partisans would often be forced to detect and execute Soviet collaborators as traitors. So, while the locals were fundamental to the survival of the partisans by providing support with supplies and information, some locals dealt critical damage to the movement by collaborating with the Soviet forces. The Forest brothers were able to effectively survive for so long during the Soviet occupation, partly because of the forests of Lithuania gave them significant strategic advantages. Partisans can conduct guerrilla warfare far more effectively when their country contains harsh terrain. This advantage is amplified if the partisans have intimate knowledge of their country. The forests in the Baltics were very dense, which provided cover for the partisan guerrilla tactics. The Lithuanians were able to carefully launch ambush attacks and then quickly disappear back into the forests. This made it extremely difficult for the Soviet forces to locate and counter them. The forests had limited visibility and divided up larger forces, damaging the Soviets' forces' ability to coordinate an offensive of superior numbers. Armored vehicles or heavily equipped infantry were rendered useless in such an environment due to their slow maneuverability. By using light weaponry and their small group tactics, partisans can move swiftly around the forests and maintain their organization and coordination. Consequently, in this terrain, the Soviet advantages of superior numbers and weaponry were significantly diminished, whereas the Lithuanians' small numbers worked to their favor. In their efforts to keep their small groups of fighters hidden and sheltered, the Forest brothers initially relied on camouflaged and isolated houses, sheds, and tents. These sites were often either extremely uncomfortable, offered little protection, or were not well hidden. Many partisan groups opted to instead construct underground bunkers. These bunkers were well camouflaged in the dense forest and often contained emergency escapes and defendable positions. The partisans would also store their supplies, including any weapons, radios, or medicines they had with them in these bunkers. They also covered their tracks when returning to their bunkers to prevent the Soviet forces from following them.
We dug and then camouflaged the bunker, distributing the soil so evenly that there was no visible elevation. We covered the bunker with last year's dry leaves and pine needles. On top of the bunker we tossed a couple of old tree stumps and hazelnut bushes.
Having these concealed bunkers gave the partisans a fairly permanent place to hide, organize, and launch operations. A well-hidden resistance movement is fairly difficult to locate and destroy, meaning these underground bunkers were an essential factor in the partisans' prolonged survival. Despite these environmental elements providing immense advantages to the Lithuanian survival, it had its downsides. The constructed bunkers were not very comfortable, and harsh winters made forest life difficult. Additionally, being in these dense forests meant securing necessary supplies such as food was incredibly difficult, and communication between partisan groups was not a simple endeavor. For these reasons, local support and having strong morale was foundational to the survival of the Lithuanian partisans. While the Soviet forces could not destroy the resistance movement by direct forest fighting alone, if they severed the partisans' local supply, they could defeat the Forest Brothers through attrition. As a result, these environmental elements served as an important purpose of providing cover and terrain advantages, but could not sustain the survival of the partisans alone without other important factors. The Lithuanian Forest Brothers adopted guerrilla tactics, which allowed them to survive and resist against the overwhelming Soviet forces. Initially, the partisans formed spontaneous individual groups. These individual groups often consisted of 7 to 10 fighters. Upon coming together as regional causes, groups would be formed under companies, communicating and coordinating amongst each other in the region as a more organized and disciplined army group. Operating as disciplined small groups of guerrilla fighters was tactically beneficial to the Lithuanians, as it was for many guerrilla movements in the 20th century. T.E. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, proved the effectiveness of small guerrilla forces being capable of defeating an enemy through gradual sabotage and harassment tactics. By operating in these small and disciplined groups, the movement of the Forest Brothers frequently went undetected, enabling their weaker force to evade the superior Soviet forces. They could choose when best to attack the enemy, giving them control over when a battle breaks out. This is a significant advantage for the outnumbered Lithuanians. They can simply wait until they encounter a small and unprepared Soviet force, or until important supplies or military stations were left practically undefended for them to attack or sabotage. In addition to how they operated and executed guerrilla tactics, the Lithuanians utilized code names to protect each other. Captured partisans were usually tortured by the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, with the aim of obtaining information on other partisans. The biggest risk, if a partisan's real identity was discovered, would be putting the lives of their relatives in danger. If identified, their family could be arrested, deported, or killed, either in retaliation or to crack down on local partisan support.
It was often the case that you only knew a partisan by his code name and by his actions. You did not know anything about his past or about his personal life, even after he was buried.
Because of the code names, if one partisan was captured, they could not give up the real identities of other partisans. Anonymity served as a useful tactic to allow partisans to operate more freely against Soviet forces, without fear of having their families put at risk. These guerrilla tactics helped to reduce casualties and inflict damage on the Soviet forces, prolonging the survivability of the movement. Foreign support is fundamental in sustaining a guerrilla force, and while the Lithuanians did not receive any significant outside help, some foreign support was available to them. The Lithuanian partisan ranks were not only full of Lithuanian nationals. Instead, the Forest Brothers strategically incorporated foreign soldiers and weapons, contributing to their supply of weapons, recruits, and intelligence. The partisans had managed to gain critical access to German military weaponry. This occurred because German soldiers, which had been parachuted into Lithuania, remained and assisted the Lithuanian resistance. They also managed to recruit German prisoners of war and deserters from the Soviet Union. Their addition to the ranks brought experience, intelligence, and much-needed supplies. Mao Zedong noted how important it is for the guerrilla force to treat prisoners from the occupying army well, as it will give the guerrillas intelligence, and it would also make it less likely that soldiers from the opposing army would fight to the death if they knew they would be treated well as prisoners upon surrendering. Following the same principle suggested by Mao, by allowing deserters into their ranks, the Lithuanians would benefit from improved intelligence, but also it would lead to more Soviet desertions. The recruitment of German and Soviet troops helped to bolster the Forest Brothers' ranks. It improved their armament supplies and weakened their opponents through promoting further desertions. Although the Lithuanians failed to obtain significant support from the West in their struggle, which hurt their chances at successfully defeating the Soviet occupation, the limited foreign support the partisans received was beneficial to their survival. The longevity of the Forest Brothers movement in Lithuania was sustained through multiple factors. Obtaining local support was essential to the movement, and the Forest Brothers were only defeated because their Lithuanian supporters were deported from Lithuania by the Soviet forces. The conditions of the partisans had to endure in order to survive and fight against the Soviet forces were extreme. However, their faith and their patriotism and their Catholic beliefs gave them the strength to fight on. The environment of Lithuania, with its dense trees and marshes, were able to conceal the partisans in any of their operations. Due to these environmental advantages, the Soviet forces found it difficult to crush the Forest Brothers through combat. This is especially the case given the guerrilla hit-and-run tactics the partisans use. While foreign support was also lacking, which partly led to the Forest Brothers' inability to successfully defeat the Soviet occupation, the partisans did greatly benefit from limited aid. The legacy of the Forest Brothers' story of resistance against overwhelming odds lives in national memory as a symbol of Lithuania's brave fight for independence.